Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Chen. I'm 34 years old, and for 9 years, my parents didn't know my address, didn't know my husband's name, and didn't know they had two granddaughters. Then one phone call changed all of that. And I need to tell you before anything else that the hardest part of this story isn't the part where they disowned me. I already knew how that felt. The hardest part is what happened the night they let me back in. Because they didn't let me back in. Not really. They let a number back in, a number with my face attached to it. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and if there's one thing I've learned from 9 years of building a life from nothing, it's that you don't get to the ending without sitting in the beginning first. So let me start there. Let me start with the version of me that still believed love in my family was something you earned if you just worked hard enough for it. I was born in a small apartment above a dry cleaner's in a city I won't name. 2 years after my parents arrived in America with 4 suitcases and a folder of documents that took them 11 years to assemble. They had survived something back home. I didn't understand the full weight of it until I was much older. Political violence, a government that made examples out of families like theirs, a escape that involved more fear than either of them ever fully described to me. They didn't talk about it like trauma. They talked about it like a debt that somehow my brother and I were born already owing. My brother Jason came 2 years after me. From the moment he could walk, I understood, in the wordless way children understand things before they can name them, that he was the reason our parents had survived. I was just the one who happened to be born first. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it's the truest sentence I can give you about my childhood, and everything else in this story only makes sense once you understand that one fact. My parents worked constantly. My father drove a delivery route 12 hours a day. My mother worked in a garment factory until it closed, and then she cleaned offices at night while I made dinner for Jason and made sure his homework got done before our parents came home, exhausted enough to fall asleep in their clothes. I was 9 years old, doing the job of a parent, and nobody thought that was unusual. It was just what daughters did. Every relative who visited our cramped 2-bedroom apartment asked Jason the same question. Going to be a doctor one day, right? And Jason, who was maybe 7, would nod like he already knew it was true, because he'd been told it was true since before he could talk. Nobody asked me what I wanted to be. They asked me if I'd helped my mother with dinner. I want to pause here and just say, if you grew up as the responsible one in your family, the one who got noticed only when something needed doing and ignored the rest of the time, you already know the shape of this story. You already know how it feels to be loved conditionally and told that's just how love works in your house. I got straight A's. I won a regional essay competition in 6th grade, and my mother put the certificate in a drawer because, in her words, we don't want Jason to feel bad. I made varsity tennis, and nobody came to a single match because my father was working, and my mother said it wasn't important enough to take time off for. Meanwhile, Jason got a participation trophy in Little League, and my father framed it and hung it in the living room like he'd won the World Series. I remember a specific Sunday, my cousin's wedding, when I was 13. I spent the entire reception in the kitchen of the rented hall, helping the caterers plate food and watching the youngest cousins so the adults could enjoy themselves, while Jason sat at the family table in a little suit, being passed around from aunt to aunt like a prize nobody had to work to win. At one point, my mother came back to check on the food and saw me standing there, sweating, holding a stack of plates, and instead of pulling me out to enjoy the party, she handed me 2 more. "You're so capable," she said, like that was a compliment instead of a sentence with a leash attached to it. I didn't understand yet that being called capable in my family was a quiet way of being told you'd never be allowed to simply exist without being useful first. There was another moment, smaller, that I still think about more than almost anything else from that whole stretch of my childhood. I was maybe 14, and I'd stayed up past midnight helping my mother iron a stack of shirts for my father's new delivery uniforms. because the deadline was the next morning and her wrists ached too badly to keep going alone. When I finally finished, exhausted, she looked at the pile of perfectly pressed shirts and said, "See, this is why we don't worry about you. Jason needs watching. You take care of yourself." At the time, I heard it as praise. It took me almost 20 years to understand it, as the moment they decided I didn't need to be parented at all, only managed. I'm not telling you this to make my brother sound like a villain. He wasn't, not yet. He was just a kid being handed a crown he never asked for, and I was a kid being handed a job I never applied for. Neither of us built that house. Our parents built it, brick by brick, out of fear and sacrifice and a belief system that said sons carry the family name forward and daughters carry the family's burdens until they're handed off to a husband who'll carry them next. By the time I was in high school, the pattern had a name in my head, even if I never said it out loud. Jason was the investment. I was the insurance policy. I babysat my cousins every weekend without being asked, because my aunt would simply drop them off and my mother would volunteer me before I even knew it was happening. I cooked, I cleaned, I translated documents for my parents because my English was better than theirs by the time I was 12. I did all of this while maintaining a 4.0 GPA because the rule in our house was simple and never spoken out loud. Complaining was for children who hadn't sacrificed enough to have earned the right to complain. When I got into a prestigious university with a partial scholarship, my parents were proud. I want to be fair and say that they were proud in the way people are proud of an investment finally showing returns. My father told the neighbors. My mother told her sister on the phone in a voice I'd never heard her use before, bright and loud and full of something that almost sounded like joy. But underneath the pride was a plan. They had already decided what my acceptance letter meant. Pre-med, then medical school, then a respectable husband, ideally another doctor, or at minimum an engineer, and then, eventually, a house close enough to theirs that I could check in on them as they aged, financially and otherwise. This wasn't a suggestion. This was, in my parents' minds, simply what was going to happen, the same way the sun was going to come up the next morning. Nobody asked me if that was the life I wanted. They didn't think they needed to ask. In their world, you didn't ask the insurance policy what it wanted to be when it grew up. You just made sure the premiums got paid. And for 2 years, I went along with it. I took organic chemistry. I shadowed a cardiologist my father's friend knew. I told myself this was fine, this was normal, this was just what good daughters did for parents who'd survived things I couldn't fully imagine. Then, in the spring of my sophomore year, almost by accident, I took an elective journalism course to fill a schedule gap. I want you to understand what that class did to me because I think this is the part of the story a lot of people skip past too quickly. It wasn't dramatic. There was no lightning bolt. It was just a professor who used to be a war correspondent standing in front of a half-empty lecture hall, talking about the responsibility of telling other people's stories honestly. And something in me that had been quiet for 20 years sat up and said, finally. I started writing for the student paper. I pitched a story about immigrant families in the city, families like mine. And when I interviewed them, I cried in my car afterward because I recognized every single thing they told me. I felt, for the first time in my life, like I was doing something that mattered to me and not just something that was assigned to me. By junior year, I had an internship at a small international news outlet. By senior year, that internship turned into an offer, not glamorous, not high-paying, but real. A position with a media organization overseas, covering stories that mattered in places most people never thought about. I remember sitting on the edge of my dorm bed, staring at that offer letter, feeling something I can only describe as terror and joy occupying the exact same space in my chest at the exact same time. Because I knew, even before I told my parents, exactly what this was going to cost me. I told them on a video call because I was too scared to do it in person. My mother's face went very still. My father didn't say anything for almost a full minute, which, if you know anything about immigrant fathers, is somehow louder than yelling. Then he said, in a voice that I can still hear if I close my eyes, "You are throwing away everything we gave you." That was the opening sentence of a fight that lasted almost a year. If you've ever sat through a family argument that never actually ends, just pauses between rounds, you know exactly what those months felt like. Every phone call became a negotiation. Every holiday became an ambush. My mother cried on calls so often that I started associating the sound of my own phone ringing with a tightening in my chest. My father told me more than once that daughters who ignore their parents' wishes always live to regret it. He said it like a fact, like a weather forecast. They called me selfish. They called me ungrateful. My mother said the words that I think were designed specifically to leave a scar. After everything we survived, you are abandoning this family for a job that pays less than what we made at the factory. I tried to explain that this wasn't abandonment. I tried to explain that I could love them and still choose a different life than the one they'd already written for me before I was born. I tried, more times than I can count, to make them see me as a separate person instead of a continuation of their plan. It didn't work. It was never going to work because in their framework, there was no version of love that didn't come with conditions attached. Relatives got pulled into it. My aunt called to tell me I was breaking my mother's heart. A family friend told me I'd regret this when I was old and alone. And Jason, who I'd protected and fed and helped with homework for years, sided with our parents almost instantly, without hesitation, like it had never even occurred to him that there might be another side to consider. I remember one call in particular, near the end of that year, where my mother tried a different tactic. She stopped yelling. She lowered her voice, almost gentle, and said, "Emily, I'm not angry anymore. I just want you to explain it to me. Explain why this job matters more than your own mother." And I tried. I really did try for almost 20 minutes to explain what that journalism class had done to me, what it felt like to finally care about my own future instead of just executing someone else's plan for it. She listened the whole time without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "I didn't understand a single word of that," and hung up, not in anger, just simply done. My father's calls were different, shorter, colder. He'd ask one question, "Have you applied to medical school yet?" And when the answer was no, he'd say, "Then we have nothing else to discuss." And the line would go dead before I could respond. Finally, on a phone call I will never forget for the rest of my life, my father gave me an ultimatum. Reject this job, apply to medical school, or leave and don't come back. I was 25 years old. I had a plane ticket in my email inbox and a decision in front of me that felt less like a choice and more like a verdict. I chose myself. I packed 2 suitcases, the same number, ironically, my parents had carried with them when they first came to this country, though I didn't realize that detail until years later. I boarded a flight, and by the time I landed halfway across the world, my parents had already disowned me. It happened fast. Within 2 weeks, my number was blocked. A care package I sent for my mother's birthday came back unopened, the tape still sealed, like it had never even been considered. Relatives stopped responding to my messages, one by one, like lights going out down a long hallway. My aunt told a cousin that I had broken my mother's heart on purpose. Jason didn't speak to me again for 9 years. If you've ever lost an entire family overnight, not through death, but through a decision they made about who you were allowed to be, you know there's a specific kind of grief for that. It's grief for people who are still alive. Grief with no funeral, no closure, no socially acceptable timeline for healing, because most people around you don't even understand what you lost. I lost almost everyone I loved in the span of about 3 weeks. And I want to be honest with you about what came next, because this isn't a story where I landed overseas and immediately started thriving. That's not what happened. What happened was much harder and much slower and much lonelier than that. The first 2 years abroad were brutal in ways I genuinely hadn't prepared for. I lived in a studio apartment with a mattress on the floor because I couldn't afford furniture yet. My salary barely covered rent and food, and some months it didn't quite cover both. So I learned which grocery stores marked down bread at the end of the day and which ones didn't. I worked long hours for very little money, chasing stories that mattered to me, but didn't pay enough to matter to my landlord. There were nights, and I'm not going to pretend there weren't, where I lay on that mattress on the floor, in a city where I barely spoke the language yet, and wondered if my father had been right. If I really had thrown away everything they gave me for a fantasy that wasn't going to pay off. I cried more in that first year than I had in the previous decade combined, and most of that crying happened alone at 2 a.m. with nobody to call because the people who used to be my call when things are hard, people were the same people who'd stopped answering. I remember one specific night, maybe 4 months in, when my landlord knocked on my door because rent was 3 days late, and I had exactly enough in my account to cover it if I didn't eat for the rest of the week. I paid him in cash. I'd counted out twice to be sure, smiled, closed the door, and then sat down on that bare floor and laughed. Actual laughter. The kind that scares you a little because it's standing right next to tears, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear my father's voice asking how the journalism career was going. I didn't call him to find out. I never called him at all that year, but I thought about it more times than I'd like to admit. And honestly, if you've ever made a decision that the people who raised you couldn't understand or support, you already know this feeling. That specific loneliness of being right about your own life and still feeling like you might be wrong, simply because there's nobody left in the room to tell you otherwise. But I kept going. I want to be clear that I'm not telling you this part of the story to make myself sound impressive. I'm telling you because the version of resilience you see in movies isn't the version that actually exists. The actual version is just getting up the next day and doing the work anyway, even when you're not sure it's going to matter. Slowly, things shifted. My reporting got noticed. I got moved onto bigger stories. I learned 2 new languages out of sheer necessity, because you can't report on people's lives if you can't understand them when they speak. I built sources, then a reputation, then eventually something that looked, from the outside, like a career. I also met someone. His name is David. He was working logistics for an aid organization when I met him, covering a story in a region that had seen more hardship in a decade than most people see in a lifetime. He was kind in a way that didn't perform itself for an audience. He asked me questions about my work that weren't really about my work. They were about understanding who I was underneath it. It took me a long time to let him in because by that point I'd built walls thick enough to survive losing an entire family. And walls like that don't come down just because someone is patient and kind. But he was patient and he was kind, and eventually the walls came down anyway. We got married 3 years after we met in a small ceremony with maybe 20 people, none of whom were related to me by blood. My boss from my first overseas job walked me down a strip of sand because I'd asked her to, and she cried more than I did, which I still tease her about to this day. A few years after that, we had twin daughters, Ava and Nora. I remember holding them for the first time in the hospital, 2 small, furious, red-faced humans who had no idea yet how loved they already were, and thinking, this is the family I built. Nobody handed this to me. Nobody assigned it to me. I chose every single piece of it, on purpose, with my eyes open. For the first time in my entire life, I had a family that loved me without conditions attached. No ledger, no comparison to a sibling, no invoice waiting at the end of it. I thought that chapter of my life, the chapter with my parents in it, was closed. Grieved, processed, filed away. I had built something good enough that I genuinely believed I didn't need anything from the people who raised me anymore, not even an apology. 9 years passed like that. 9 years of silence so complete that I sometimes forgot what my mother's laugh sounded like. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, while I was making dinner for my daughters and half listening to David tell me about his day, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. It was Jason. I want to be honest with you about the half second before I answered that call, because I think it tells you everything about what 9 years of silence does to a person. My first thought wasn't hope. It wasn't even curiosity. My first thought was someone died. That's the only scenario my brain could construct for why my brother, who hadn't spoken a word to me in 9 years, would suddenly be calling. I answered with my hand shaking slightly, my voice already braced for grief. Emily, Jason said, and his voice sounded older than I remembered, rougher around the edges. It's me. Is everyone okay? I asked. Not hello, not how are you, just the question that mattered. There was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you the answer is complicated. Everyone's fine, he said. Mom and Dad, they want to see you. They've been talking about it for a while now. They want to reconnect. I stood in my kitchen, holding a wooden spoon, staring at a pot of pasta that suddenly seemed very far away, and I didn't know what to say. If you've ever gotten a call like that, out of nowhere after years of silence, from someone who once chose a side against you without hesitation, you know that there isn't a clean emotion for that moment. It's not relief, it's not anger, it's this strange suspended feeling like standing at the edge of a pool you're not sure is actually full of water. Why now? I asked. Jason hesitated again. They're getting older, he said. They've had time to think. I think they regret how things went. I should tell you, looking back, that I noticed something in that sentence even then in real time and chose not to examine it too closely. He said they regretted how things went, not what they did, not the things they said. How things went, like weather, like an accident nobody had actually caused. I told him I needed time to think about it. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen for what felt like a very long time, while David quietly took over making dinner without asking a single question, because he's the kind of man who knows when to give you room before you're ready to talk. That night, after the girls were asleep, I told him everything Jason had said. David listened the way he always listens, fully, without interrupting, without rushing to give me an opinion before I'd finished forming my own. What do you want to do? He finally asked. I don't know, I said, and that was the truest thing I could have told him. Because some small, stubborn 9-year-old part of me, the part of me that used to set the table every night, hoping somebody would notice, still wanted, more than I was willing to admit out loud, for my parents to say they were sorry. So I said yes, against what I now recognize as my better judgment, against nearly a decade of evidence about exactly who these people were. I said yes to seeing them again. And if you've ever made a decision with your heart, while your gut was quietly screaming at you to slow down, you already know exactly where this story is going. But I needed to see it through anyway. I think some part of me needed proof, one way or the other, before I could let the question go for good. We agreed to meet at a small restaurant, neutral ground, the kind of place where nobody would make a scene because there were too many strangers around to witness it. I left David and the girls at home. I told myself this first meeting needed to be just me, without anything else to manage or protect. I want to describe walking into that restaurant honestly, because it's one of those moments I've replayed so many times that I can recall details I probably shouldn't even remember. The specific shade of the tablecloth, the smell of garlic from the kitchen, the particular way the light came through the window and landed on the table where my parents were already sitting, waiting for me. They looked older, smaller somehow than the version of them I'd carried in my memory for 9 years. My father's hair had gone fully gray. My mother's hands, when she reached out to take mine, trembled slightly in a way I didn't remember them doing before. For one unguarded moment, before anything else happened, I felt something crack open in my chest. Hope, I think. Plain, undignified hope. You look good, my mother said, and her eyes were wet. You look happy. We sat. We ordered food none of us really ate, and for almost 45 minutes, something genuinely warm happened at that table. My mother asked about my work, and actually listened to the answer, instead of waiting for her turn to talk. My father told an old story about a road trip we'd taken when I was 6, a story I'd forgotten entirely. And for a moment, we were all laughing about it together, the three of us, like the version of a family that exists in commercials. At one point, my mother reached across the table and touched the small scar above my eyebrow, the one I'd gotten falling off a bike when I was 8, and said, "I remember exactly how scared I was that day. I thought you'd need stitches." I hadn't known she remembered that at all. For 9 years, I'd assumed every soft memory of me had simply been filed away or replaced, and hearing her describe it so precisely, down to the color of the bike, made something in my chest loosen that I hadn't realized was still clenched. My mother cried a little, dabbing her eyes with a napkin, saying she'd missed me more than she knew how to say. I remember thinking, maybe this is real. Maybe 9 years was long enough for something to actually change in them. Maybe people can grow, even people who raised you in a house with so many unspoken rules that love felt like a transaction. I want you to sit in that hope with me for a second, because I think it's important that you understand I wasn't a fool walking into a trap with my eyes closed. I was a daughter, allowing herself, very cautiously, to believe in the possibility of repair. And then my father set down his fork, looked at me with an expression I recognized instantly, even after 9 years. The expression he used to wear right before asking Jason about his grades, and said the sentence that changed the entire temperature of the room. "So," he said, "how much do you make now?" I want to pause right here because I think this is the exact moment where I need you to feel what I felt. That small, ordinary-sounding question landing in the middle of a conversation that, up until that point, had felt like healing. The warmth in the room didn't disappear all at once. It drained out slowly, like air leaving a tire you don't notice is flat until you're already on the side of the road. "Why do you ask?" I said, carefully. My mother and father exchanged a look, a specific kind of look, the look of two people who had rehearsed something and were now deciding who would say the next line. My father told me plainly that things had been hard, that Jason, the brother who had been groomed since birth to become a doctor, the brother our parents had built their entire retirement plan around, had never finished medical school. He'd dropped out during his second year, gone into business instead, and the business had failed. Spectacularly, apparently, and more than once. He had accumulated significant debt. And for years, my parents had quietly bailed him out, again and again, dipping into savings they couldn't actually afford to lose, because in their minds, that's simply what parents did for the family's chosen son. Now they were in their 60s, with almost nothing left, facing the kind of medical and housing costs that come with aging, in a country where they'd spent decades working jobs that never gave them real retirement security to begin with. I sat there, processing this, feeling something complicated and tangled twist in my chest. Sympathy, yes, genuine sympathy, because nobody deserves to be old and afraid about money. But also something else underneath it, something colder, that I wasn't ready to name yet. And then my mother said the sentence that I think, more than any other moment in this entire story, told me exactly what this dinner had actually been. "We've already talked about it," she said, reaching for my hand again, the same gesture that had felt so warm 45 minutes earlier and now felt like something closing around my wrist. "It's time for you to help." I asked very carefully what that meant, and that's when the list came out. They wanted, specifically, and I remember every item because my father had clearly thought about the order in which to present them. A larger house in a safer neighborhood, one they could move into immediately. Monthly financial support, an actual fixed amount, stated as casually as if we were discussing a phone bill. Full-time caretakers, because my mother's knees weren't what they used to be, and my father's blood pressure had become a concern. All medical expenses covered, going forward, indefinitely. And this was the detail that genuinely took my breath away. Protections for Jason's future inheritance. To make sure that whatever I gave them eventually made its way to him, regardless of what I might have built for my own children. They spoke about all of this with the calm certainty of people discussing something that had already been decided. Not a request, not a hope, a plan, already finalized in their minds, that simply required my signature. "You can afford it," my father said, not as a question. He'd clearly done some research, or or someone had looked me up online and found enough to draw conclusions. "We raised you, we fed you, we paid for your education. This is what daughters do." I sat there in that restaurant, surrounded by the smell of garlic and the soft murmur of strangers having normal conversations at normal dinners. And I felt something inside me go very, very still. "You haven't asked about my husband," I said quietly. "You haven't asked his name. You haven't asked about your granddaughters. You don't know their names either." My mother blinked, like the observation genuinely hadn't occurred to her as relevant. "We will," she said. "Of course we will. There's time for that. There's time for that." As if my children were a line item to be addressed after the budget had been settled. And then my father said the sentence I will never, for the rest of my life, be able to forget. "We knew you would come around eventually." If you've ever had a moment where an entire relationship reorganizes itself in your mind in real time, where every warm memory you've been holding on to suddenly gets refiled under a different, colder category, you know exactly what happened to me in that restaurant. "We knew you would come around eventually." Not "we're sorry," not "we missed you," not even "we were wrong." Just a quiet, confident statement that the daughter who had once dared to choose her own life had predictably circled back to her assigned role, exactly as planned, exactly on schedule. They hadn't called me back because they missed me. They'd called me back because Jason's failure had created a financial hole, and I was the only resource left capable of filling it. This wasn't reconciliation. This wasn't even really an apology dressed up as one. This was a recruitment. I sat there for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably only seconds, running back through the last 45 minutes of warmth, the story about the road trip, my mother's tears, the way she'd held my hand. And I felt sick, genuinely sick, at how easily I'd let myself believe it had been about love. I want to be honest with you because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. In that moment, some small, exhausted part of me actually considered saying yes, not because I owed them anything. I want to be very clear. I don't think I owed them anything by that point, but because some old, deeply worn groove in my brain still equated saying no to my parents with being a bad daughter, even after 9 years of silence, even after everything. That's what conditional love does to a person. It doesn't just hurt you while it's happening. It leaves behind wiring that takes years, sometimes a lifetime, to fully untangle. But I didn't say yes. And I didn't say no either, not yet. I told them I needed time to think, the same words I'd used with Jason on the phone, and I watched my father's face shift, just slightly, into something that looked almost like irritation, like a man who'd expected to close a deal that night and was annoyed at the delay. I drove home in silence. And when I walked through my front door, David took one look at my face and didn't ask a single question. He just held me while I cried in a way I hadn't cried since those long nights on the mattress on the floor 9 years and one entire lifetime ago. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay there next to David, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the occasional shuffle of one of the girls turning over in their sleep down the hall, and I thought about everything. The certificate my mother hid in a drawer, the framed participation trophy, the phone call where my father told me daughters who ignore their parents always regret it, the 9 years of silence, and now this. This dinner, this list, this sentence, "We knew you would come around eventually," that I suspected would live in my head for the rest of my life, whether I wanted it to or not. In the morning, I called my best friend from my first job overseas, the woman who'd walked me down the aisle, and I told her everything. She listened, and then she asked me a question that I think cut straight to the actual heart of the matter. "Do you want to help them?" she asked. "Or do you feel like you're supposed to want to help them?" I didn't have an answer right away. And I think that not having an answer right away was actually the most honest place I could have started from. Because here's the truth nobody tells you about situations like this. It's not a simple villain story. My parents weren't monsters out of a movie. They had survived something brutal back home. They had worked themselves into exhaustion for decades. There was a version of this where helping them genuinely was the decent thing to do, the grateful thing to do, the thing you do for parents who gave you a life in this country, even if they gave it to you with strings so tight they nearly strangled me. But there was another version too. A version where saying yes meant funding the exact same hierarchy that had spent my entire childhood treating me like a backup plan. A version where every dollar I sent would become, in their minds, confirmation that they'd been right all along, that I'd been wrong to leave, wrong to choose journalism, wrong to choose myself, and that the only reason any of it had worked out was because I'd eventually come crawling back to fulfill the role they'd assigned me at birth. And there was Jason's inheritance protection clause sitting underneath all of it like a splinter I couldn't stop pressing on. They weren't just asking me to take care of them. They were asking me to fund my brother's future, the same brother who had been handed every advantage growing up and had still managed, somehow, to need rescuing twice. Once from medical school he never finished, and now from a business that failed, with me expected to quietly absorb both costs, while also guaranteeing he'd inherit whatever was left over. I spent the next week doing something I don't think my parents expected me to do. I researched. Quietly, carefully, I pieced together, through Jason himself, through a cousin who still spoke to both sides, through small details that slipped out over a few careful phone calls, exactly how deep the debt actually went, and exactly how much of it had been caused not by bad luck, but by repeated, almost willful financial recklessness that our parents had enabled every single time instead of letting him face the consequences. It wasn't one bad year. It was over a decade of bailouts, each one larger than the last, each one justified by the same unspoken belief that had shaped my entire childhood, that Jason's failures were the family's responsibility to absorb, and my success was the family's resource to extract. By the end of that week, I understood something clearly for the first time. This wasn't a story about parents who needed help in their old age. This was the same story I'd been living inside since I was 9 years old, just with the numbers finally large enough that everyone could see them. I called Jason first before I called our parents back. I think I needed to hear directly from him whether he understood what was actually being asked of me, or whether he was as blind to it as our parents seemed to be. "Do you know what they want from me?" I asked him. There was a long pause on the line. "I know it's a lot," he said finally. "But they're getting old. And I can't." He stopped himself. "You can't what, Jason?" "I can't fix it," he said, quieter now. "I tried. I really did try. It just didn't work out the way I thought it would." And for 1 second, just one, I almost felt sorry for him, this man who'd been handed every expectation in the family and had spent his entire adult life failing to live up to a dream that was never actually his to begin with, any more than medical school had ever really been mine. But then he said something that snapped that sympathy shut like a door. "You're the only one who can fix this now," he said. "You owe it to them. You left. I stayed. I owe it to them." As if leaving had been the crime, and staying and draining their savings dry. Staying and never once questioning whether the dream they'd handed him was a dream he actually wanted, had somehow been the sacrifice. "I didn't leave because I didn't love them," I said. "I left because they made it impossible to love them and be myself at the same time. There's a difference, Jason, even if nobody in this family has ever been willing to see it." He didn't have an answer for that. We hung up without resolving anything, but something in me had already resolved itself, somewhere in the space between his words and mine. I called my parents back 2 days later, and I asked to meet them one more time, in person, just the three of us. My mother sounded hopeful when she agreed. I think, even then, some part of her still believed this was going to end with me saying yes. The second meeting happened at their apartment, the same apartment I'd grown up translating documents in, the same apartment where my mother once hid an essay competition certificate in a drawer because she didn't want my brother to feel bad. Walking back into it after 9 years felt like stepping into a museum exhibit of my own childhood, every piece of furniture exactly where I remembered it, the framed Little League trophy still sitting in its place of honor on the shelf. I brought a folder with me. Not legal paperwork, nothing dramatic like that, just notes I'd written for myself the night before, because I knew if I walked in without a plan, the old groove in my brain would take over and I'd find myself agreeing to things I didn't actually believe in, the way I'd nearly done at the restaurant. My father started by repeating the list as if maybe I hadn't fully absorbed it the first time. The house, the monthly support, the caretakers, the inheritance protections for Jason. I let him finish completely before I said anything. I'd learned over 9 years of building a career out of asking hard questions and sitting in uncomfortable silences, that the person who talks first in a moment like this usually loses control of it. I'm not going to do any of that, I said finally. My voice didn't shake, which surprised me because I'd expected it to. My mother's face crumpled instantly. After everything we did for you, I know what you did for me, I said. I've never denied it. You worked yourselves into the ground. You gave me a life in this country that you fought hard for. I'm grateful for that, genuinely, and I will be grateful for it for the rest of my life. Then why? Because gratitude isn't a blank check, I said. And I am not the solution to a problem you created by treating Jason's mistakes like they were more important to fix than my entire childhood was to value. My father's jaw tightened. We are your parents, he said, like the title itself should have ended the conversation. You were, I said. And then you weren't for 9 years by choice. Your choice. You blocked my number. You sent back a gift unopened. You told relatives I'd broken Mom's heart on purpose, and not one of you reached out, not once, in 9 years, to ask how I was doing, whether I was safe, whether I was even still alive. You didn't reconnect with me because you missed your daughter. You reconnected with me because Jason ran out of money and I was the only name left on the list. That is not fair, my father said, his voice rising. We did not call you because of money. We called because we are getting old. Is that so hard to believe? You asked me how much I make before you asked me one single question about my children, I said. That's not me being unfair. That's just what happened. I was there. I remember the order things came in. My mother flinched at that, like the sequence of it had only just become visible to her, replayed back in a stranger's mouth. You don't understand what it is like, my father said, to come to this country with nothing, to build something from nothing, and watch your own children walk away from it like it costs them nothing to do so. I don't doubt what it cost you to come here, I said, and I meant it, because I did believe that. I had always believed that. But you've spent my whole life making sure I never forgot what it cost you, and somehow Jason never had to carry that weight the same way I did. He got to fail twice and still be protected. I left once on my own terms and I got erased. The room went very quiet. My mother was crying again, but it sounded different this time. Not the soft, hopeful crying from the restaurant, but something rawer, something closer to actually being confronted with the truth for the first time. We knew you would come around, my father said again, quieter this time, almost like he was trying the sentence on again to see if it still fit. I know you did, I said. And that's exactly the problem. You weren't waiting for your daughter to come home. You were waiting for your investment to mature. I told them, as clearly and calmly as I could manage, what I was willing to do and what I wasn't. I was not going to buy them a house. I was not going to commit to open-ended monthly payments. I was not going to fund full-time caretakers indefinitely, with no boundaries and no endpoint, simply because the request had been delivered with the assumption that I had no right to refuse it. And I was absolutely not going to sign away anything related to Jason's inheritance, a man in his 30s who needed to face the consequences of his own choices instead of being protected from them for the 4th or 5th time by money that wasn't even his parents to keep giving away. what I was willing to do, and I want to be honest, this part surprised even me because some softer part of me still wanted to find a version of this that didn't end in complete severance, was help with specific defined medical costs directly, paid to providers rather than handed over as cash for a limited period while they explored what actual retirement support programs they might qualify for. I offered to help them apply for the benefits and assistance many immigrant families in their position never learn exist, because that was a skill I actually had, built from years of reporting on exactly these communities. I offered an open invitation to know my children, to actually be grandparents, with no conditions attached except basic decency and an understanding that my daughters would never be used as leverage the way I had been. What I refused, completely and without negotiation, was the idea that any of this came with strings attached to Jason's future, or that it represented some kind of permanent reopening of the same arrangement that had defined my entire childhood, where my worth was measured in what I could provide and never in who I actually was. My father didn't take it well. He stood up at one point, said something sharp about ungrateful children and everything sacrificed for nothing. And for a moment, I watched the version of him that had built my entire childhood, the version who measured love and obligation, try one more time to reassert control over a conversation that had already slipped past his ability to control it. My mother, though, and this is the part of this story that still surprises me when I think about it, my mother eventually said something I hadn't expected. "I don't know how to be your mother any other way," she said quietly, looking down at her hands. "I only know how I was raised. I only know what I was taught love was supposed to look like." It wasn't an apology. Not exactly. But it was the first honest sentence either of them had said to me in 9 years, and something about its honesty mattered more to me than an apology might have. "Then maybe," I said, "this is where you start learning a different way. If you want any relationship with me or with your granddaughters, it starts there, not with a list, with actually wanting to know us. I'm not going to tell you this story ended with a perfect, tearful reconciliation, because that's not what happened. And I think stories like this do a disservice to everyone listening when they pretend complicated things resolve neatly. What happened instead was slower and messier, and more honest than that. My father didn't speak to me again for almost 4 months after that meeting. I think for him, my refusal to fulfill the role he'd assigned me felt like a second abandonment, even though I would argue, and I do, in my own head, fairly often, that you cannot abandon a role you never agreed to take in the first place. My mother called, eventually, on her own, without Jason coordinating it for her. She asked hesitantly if she could see a photo of the girls. I sent her one. She cried on the phone, and this time I believed the tears were actually about missing something rather than losing access to something. It's been a little over a year since that dinner where my father asked how much I made. My mother has met my daughters twice now, both times under conditions I set myself, both times without my father present, because he still hasn't been willing to show up without bringing the old ledger with him. The first time she met them, she sat on the floor of our living room, completely still, just watching them stack blocks for almost 20 minutes before she said anything at all. Ava handed her a block without being asked, the way 4-year-olds sometimes do when they decide, for no reason adults can predict, that someone is safe. My mother held that single wooden block in her hand like it weighed something. I didn't say anything about it. I just let it happen. Jason and I speak occasionally, carefully, like two people rebuilding something across a gap neither of us fully knows how to close. He told me once, on one of those calls, that he envied how I'd managed to walk away and build something entirely my own, and I told him, honestly, that I didn't think what I had was something he could simply decide to envy his way into. It cost me everything I had for years. There's no shortcut version of that. I paid for one of my father's medical procedures directly, to the hospital, no cash changing hands, no strings attached, no acknowledgement expected. I don't know if he ever found out it was me specifically, or if he assumes it came through some program. I've decided I don't actually need him to know. I did it because it was the decent thing to do for an aging man who is still somewhere underneath everything, my father. Not because I owed it to him, because I chose to. A few weeks after the procedure, my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd seemed quieter than usual, more reflective, in a way she couldn't quite explain. I didn't tell her why. Some gifts mean more when the giver doesn't ask for credit, and I think some part of me needed to prove that to myself as much as to him. I helped my mother apply for benefits she didn't know existed. That relationship, slow and careful as it is, feels like the only piece of this entire story that's actually healing in real time, rather than just ending. And I have not and will not buy them a house. I have not and will not sign anything protecting Jason's inheritance at the expense of my own daughter's future. Some boundaries, once I finally found the strength to draw them, turned out to be lines I was never going to move again. No matter how many times the request got repackaged as love or duty or gratitude. If you've made it this far with me, I think you probably already know what I want to leave you with, but I want to say it plainly anyway, because I needed someone to say it plainly to me 9 years ago, and nobody did. Loving your parents and owing your parents are not the same thing. Gratitude for a sacrifice does not obligate you to an unlimited, undefined debt that someone else gets to set the terms of. And you are allowed, actually allowed, not just theoretically allowed, to choose the life that feels true to you, even if the people who raised you never forgive you for it. I think about that sentence often. We knew you would come around eventually. I used to hear it and feel a cold, sinking kind of shame, like I'd been caught somewhere I shouldn't have been. Now I hear it differently. Now I hear it as proof of exactly how little they understood me, even after everything, because I never came around.